tutorial, we're going to continue working on using the pen tool, and we are also going to talk a little bit about how to effectively create additional subshapes. So that way we have something that's a little bit more visually interesting beyond just a black silhouette. So if you haven't done so already, please download the image that's in Blackboard and place it in the folder with your name on it. Uh, it should have a super easy to remember title, Scissors to Trace. And we're going to bring this into Illustrator. So if you haven't done so already, we're going to create a new file. And again, 8.5 by 11 is fine. For these purposes, we really only need one artboard. I don't intend to print this or put it on the web, so we don't need to really worry about the presets here. But we are going to give it a title. So we can call it Pen Tool 2 Demo and your last name, or something that along those lines that allows you to keep it organized. Once you have this set up, and again, make sure you have it set to inches, we are going to hit create. And now that I have this beautiful white artboard, I'm going to go into Finder and find that image that I downloaded, and I'm going to click, drag, and place it into Illustrator. And now I'm going to have to shrink it back down. So I'm going to hit the Shift key and scale this down to something that's a little bit more manageable. As we did in the last exercise, we are going to trace this. So we're going to do a couple of things. If I try to trace this now, I'm going to have to deal with this blue kind of flashing background, and I don't really want to deal with that. So we're going to go over to our layers panel, and we're going to create a new layer. And I'm going to call it trace layer. You can make as many layers as you need for this exercise. We're just going to start with the one. And then we are going to lock that bottom layer. Now, if you want to drop the opacity on these, if you feel like you would have a better time of it, if these were lighter, by all means, go ahead, head over to properties and drop down that opacity. But I think for these purposes, we should be able to see sufficiently. And now what we are going to do is we're going to use the pen tool as we did before. I'm going to make sure that I have the fill turned off. So if I look over here, I've got the fill in front and it's a white square telling me that it is going to fill in, which I don't want. So I'm going to go over here and hit that none option. And I want to make sure that my stroke is turned on, which I can see because I have this little black square. And you can start wherever you would like. And we're going to trace the contour of these forms. So again, whenever you hit an intersection like this, a sharp corner, we're going to want to create a curve. And when I only want to move one handlebar, I'm going to hold down on that option key. And I'm not being too cautious with this right now for the sake of an exercise. My concern is not to get this perfect, but rather just to get this to where it's a close facsimile. If you do want to ignore that little bump, that is totally fine. It really isn't going to do anything for our image. All right. And once you have your outline done, we're going to turn on the fill, which I can also do just by clicking these arrows, which will reverse the inside and outside. Like so. And what's nice about that is it can kind of indicate if I've missed any areas or if there are areas that like I could have kind of brought farther out. And again, if I do need to adjust an anchor point, I'm just going to hit the letter A on my keyboard to bring up my direct selection tool. And then if I tap on an anchor point, it will activate them so I can then go in and make any adjustments that I need to perfect my silhouette. But as I mentioned before, at the start of the tutorial, this would be a kind of boring project if we were to just leave this as a solid black mass. So we're going to start to break this up. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to actually go over to my layers panel, and I'm going to click on this eyeball right here next to that initial path that I made that traces the scissors, because I actually want to go in and trace these negative areas. So I'm going to bring up my pen tool again, and I'm going to trace those negative areas. Make sure that your fill is turned off. And I'm going to go back in and just start to get this contour. And because this is going to be a negative area, if I go over to my properties panel, I'm actually going to set the fill to white now, and I am going to turn off the stroke because I don't really need it. And now that I'm in layers, I can then go back to that layer that I turned off and turn it on and see how it looks, which in my opinion, pretty decent. But the problem is if I want to take this object and let's say I have them overlapping, so I'm just going to copy and paste. If this is meant to be translucent, this white area is opaque, meaning that I won't be able to see behind it, which can be visually kind of distracting. So what I'm going to do is use a tool called the pathfinder tool. And so we're going to select the two paths that we need to kind of unite. And so in this case, that's going to be that circle that I just made along with the scissors. And I want to make sure that the hole, right, this is going to be a cutout. So I want to make sure that the thing that's being cut out is going to be on top, which I can see in my layers panel that it is. If I go back to properties, I should see an option that says Pathfinder near the bottom. If you do not see this, you can also go to Window and then scroll down and you will see Pathfinder. We are going to use the second icon, which if I hover over it says minus front. And so if I click on this, you'll notice that all of a sudden I have this negative area, which I am now going to do with the other side. So again, I'm going to just turn off that bottom layer and I'm going to bring my pen tool back. I'm going to turn off my fill just so I can see what I'm doing. Create that circle. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not being as precise. And now that I have that, if I want to, I can go over to properties and set the fill to white, but I don't really need to because ultimately this is going to be cut out. In layers, I need to make sure that that back layer is on. And then I'm going to select both objects that I need to have cut out and go over to properties and select that Pathfinder option again. And voila, now I have these negative areas cut out. But again, these are still reading as a little bit flat, and I want to give them some visual interest. And there are a lot of ways to do this. We can consider adding highlights and shapes of light and dark, but that's not the only way to go about it. But that's where we're going to start because I think it's an easy entry point. So what I want you to do next is now that you have this, you're going to go back to layers, and I'm going to click that eyeball to turn this off. And I'm going to bring my pen tool back, and I'm going to start tracing things in white because I've got a white background. And I'm going to turn my fill off. And I'm going to click P for pen. And now I'm going to look for some of these highlights. So maybe right here, I've got this nice kind of line. Right here, it gets just a little bit brighter. And then there's this sort of highlight right along here. So I'm going to kind of click and drag to bring that line out. Now in this case, what's starting to happen is I'm starting to get that fill, which I don't really want. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to turn, or I'm going to reverse this. So instead of having the fill, I'm going to set that to stroke. But now this is kind of a clunky line. And so I'm going to go to properties, and then under stroke, I'm going to kind of plump it up just a little bit, and then click on where it says stroke. And at the bottom where it says profile, I can start to play with different profiles, which will give me more interesting lines and contours. So I'm going to opt for that first one. And I'm going to go through and add a few more kind of shapes of interest. So maybe right here where it gets kind of bright. What I can do is if I want to get a sense of how this is starting to look, if I go back to layers, I'll turn on that bottom layer. And if I zoom out, it's starting to look pretty sharp. Now there are changes that we can always go back and make. I think this is getting a little close to the edge. So if I click on that A key to bring my direct selection tool, I can then go back in and start to smooth things out. Maybe deleting an anchor point, getting more fluid curves. And playing around to get it where I want it. And so this is going to be a really helpful way of beginning to break these shapes out into subshapes. And do be mindful that you continue to turn that layer off and on. And you can also turn off that back layer just to see how it reads by itself, which I find once I turn that off, feels much better. The other thing to keep in mind is when we're using a stroke that becomes wider, such as this, the problem with this is because it's a stroke, it's not a shape, this is not going to scale down consistently with the rest of this object. And what I mean by that is if I go and I take my cursor and I select this whole thing, and I'm actually going to group it by hitting Command G, just so that way I don't have to worry about losing anything. And then I'm going to copy it, Command C, and paste it, Command V. And what I'm going to do now is for this project, you might want to have smaller objects. So I'm going to go over, hit the Shift key, and I'm going to start to shrink this down. And you'll notice, now that I've shrunk it down, that path that I made is no longer skinny and delicate. It's kind of heavy and clunky. And that's telling me that I need to actually go back and turn this into a shape. And so if you are using paths and playing with the stroke and plan to shrink an object down or enlarge it, and you want to keep this to scale, what you're going to do, and I'm going to ungroup this, which you can right click, hit ungroup. I'm going to click on this, go to object at the top of the screen, and where it says path, we're going to hit outline stroke, which now turns that into a shape rather than a line. The next thing that we're going to talk about is locking these. So I'm actually going to hide my background again. And as these become more complex, it's going to be very important that we start to group these and label them. So if you haven't grouped them yet, I'm going to go back in and group these shapes, Command G. Move them around, make sure I'm not missing anything. And if I want to, as I go and I create different objects, I'm probably going to want to title these. So you might call them scissors or first item or, whatever the object is, but some clue to let you know which shape is where, because as you build more of these, it's going to be harder and harder to identify what's where. So let's say you're working on this composition and you've got a few of these and you want to see how they look extending off the page. One thing that's always visually distracting is seeing where the object kind of continues because we don't have that sense of closure. And so if you place a couple of these kind of wherever you would like, I'm not really worried about the composition right now. I'm just sort of placing them to demonstrate how to do what's called a clipping mask. And so the way a clipping mask works is it essentially functions like a cookie cutter. So I need to create what my cookie cutter is. And in this case, I want it to be the outline or the size of the artboard. So if I go to my little rectangle tool and I want to make sure my fill is turned off, And I'm going to click. I'm going to make sure I've deselected the objects and then turn off my fill. And I'm going to click and I'm going to drag from one corner to another to cover that entire artboard. And once this has been covered, the next thing I have to do is I have to figure out what it is I want to cut. And so in essence, these objects almost function as the cookie dough. So if I go over back to my regular selection tool, I can just click and drag to highlight everything. And you'll see now all of these objects are selected, which means that that rectangle I made will know what it is that it needs to cut. And that clipping mask option is going to be an object. And then you'll see it near the bottom. And the keyboard shortcut is going to be Command 7. And if you click it, now my objects are cropped and I have a much cleaner sense of what my composition looks like. But the nice thing about a clipping mask is it doesn't delete material, it doesn't automatically crop it. So I can go back in, if I double click on an object, it still exists, so I can play around with where it is and the position and continue to edit it without it being deleted or having to recreate anything. And so those tools are going to be really helpful as you continue to work on your shape variation or visual movement project.